This is Chad Collins from IMAGIN here. I just kind of wanted to introduce you guys for everybody on the phone. It's, as you know, Pictometry. Jeff Leonhard is the district manager for Ohio and Michigan, and we have Thom Salter on, and he's the director of photogrammetric production. Is that correct, Jeff?
Thom?
Yes, that's correct. Correct enough anyway. Director of Mapping and Pictometry.
Yeah. Well, thanks for volunteering your time and efforts today, and I think it'll be really good.
Well, thank you guys for giving us this opportunity.
Yes, definitely. One thing we'll ask before we get started, you know, sometimes with the the speaker phones and everything, we'll get feedback, and it'll be hard for be a lot of feedback. So if you can mute all your phones, so that there's no feedback. If you have any questions, you can type them in via the chat, or we can save them all to the end. And if you can't hear me, type it in via the chat if there's any problems with that. And we are recording this so that at the end, I think Chad wanted to be able to make it available to others who couldn't attend. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Like Chad said, my name is Jeff Leonhard. I'm the district manager. I cover Ohio and Michigan. Based out of Ohio, but I'm up in Michigan usually every other week, if not more often than that. My background is in cartography, GIS, so I can hopefully answer any questions you have. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to give a real quick background about our company and then what we do, and then Thom's going to go in a little bit more in depth into the history of intelligent oblique imagery and a lot more scientific information than what I will give, and then at the end I'll go through the applications and how oblique imagery is being used around the country currently. So a little bit of background about Pictometry. We were established in the year 2000. We were headquartered in Rochester, New York. There's a lot of imaging science that comes out of Rochester. We've grown pretty quickly. We're more than 300 employees, and we have over 1,200 county clients around the country. We've captured imagery in all 50 states and in 40 different countries around the world. We currently have 73 aircraft in our fleet. It's the largest aerial imagery fleet in the world, and we actually custom and manufacture our camera systems, and we have the only USGS certified oblique camera capture system in the world. Earlier this year, in January of 2013, we merged with a company called EagleView Technologies. And a little bit of timeline about that. So Pictometry was established in 2000. EagleView came around in 2008. They specialize in using aerial imagery to create measurements and reports for roofs and walls and things like that for the insurance industry and the roofing industry. So between our two companies, we have almost 30 patents. And again, we merged in January of this year. This is our current coverage in Michigan. Not all of these places have imagery. The lighter color imagery is imagery that was captured for a third party and not necessarily for the client, or the brighter green, I guess you will. And then some of these counties have flown multiple times. Kalamazoo County, for example, I think we've flown 3 times. Grand Rapids and Kent County, we've flown multiple times. Same with Genesee and some others. So, and then the yellow is some other products we offer as well. This is our current coverage across the country. So, like I said, we've captured something in every state. Even some of the states, it's just little bits of stuff, like in Montana and out west. Hardly anybody flies countywide because the counties are, 2,000 to 3,000 square miles apiece. But we do have imagery coverage in Alaska and Hawaii as well. And now I'm going to flip it over to Thom Salter and let him take over. So, if you could switch over so that Thom has the screen.
Okay. And let me. Okay, so everybody see appropriately now the digital aerial oblique imagery technology and methods. Jeff, you got that coming through, right?
I see it. Hopefully everybody else can too. Yeah.
Okay. All right, very good. Okay, thanks, Jeff. I'm going to take you guys through digital aerial oblique imagery, really just kind of an overview of some of what we do about it, starting with a history of what we've done and with the technology over the years. I'll give a little background piece I call ray tracing. This is an introductory piece that kind of helps motivate some of the other slides. Talk a little bit about collection requirements, in particular how collection requirements differ for oblique imagery as compared with traditional orthogonal imagery. A little bit about technologies that can be used to collect imagery and how the choice of technology can affect the presentation of that data. And then we'll talk specifically about the way in which we present digital oblique data, and then some on making measurements inside the imagery. So for the history of what we've done with oblique imagery, Pictometry started really working in 1996. This picture is from back then. This is our CTO right there, Steve Schultz. You can see his late 90s haircut. There's also some duct tape and
if everybody
board
could
involved.
mute their phones, please. Sorry, Tom. I'm having trouble
No,
here.
no problem. No problem. So yeah, in 1996, this is kind of where we were. This is, there's a lot of testing, like I said, a lot of duct tape and bungee cord and stuff involved. I came into the company around the year 2000, which is when we first produced when we produced our first system that actually produced data that we were able to deliver to customers. We used off-the-shelf cameras. We used a single camera at a time. We had to mount that sensor either in the nadir position or in the oblique position, and then go back and fly again the other way, and then fly in a different direction again to capture imagery facing a different direction. Our initial products, for that reason, were typically two-way oblique image collections. You have to choose either north-south or east-west, essentially. And at that time, we were still using those commercial off-the-shelf products. By 2005, we developed our first Pentaview sensor system, and that's the system which we currently deploy the third version of. The first system was our first 5-sensor configuration with the nadir and the 4 obliques, all firing and operating at the same time. We used an 11 megapixel sensor at that point in time. We've currently moved up to the 3rd generation. The 2nd generation there used a 16 megapixel sensor, and today we're up to a 29 megapixel sensor, which was fully deployed in 2012. We actually started to deploy it a little bit in fall of 2011. So with that advance in technology, what's really happened here is we've been able to take the GSD, which essentially is the data density that we're collecting and delivering to users, from a standard product of a standard neighborhood of 6-inch GSD down to where now GSD is at 3-inch, which is essentially a 4x multiplier on the data that's being delivered. Here's a couple of quick shots right here. This is our 29 megapixel sensor in the lab being lined up for calibration. This is what it looks like mounted in what we call our twister mount. You can see it's a rotating pod for yaw correction. This is looking up from the belly of the aircraft in there, and you can see all 5 of the sensors with the 4 obliques, both aimed across each other, and as the forward and aft across each other, and what will be the left and right across each other as well. Let's talk a little bit about ray tracing. This is, like I said before, to kind of motivate some of these other slides to help with a little bit of background. What happens when we take an image? So light rays arrive at the Earth from the sun, bounce off the surface of the ground, pass up back into the atmosphere. Some of them head towards the aircraft that we're capturing from. Some of those light rays pass through that camera lens and then hit the sensor in the back, forming an image. If we want to use this image to make some measurements, we need to know where that camera is. If we know where the camera is and where it's pointing, we can kind of mathematically, through this process called ray tracing, walk back down to the ground. And when we get to the ground, we can know, if we know when to stop, and I'll talk a little about that in a moment, we can then calculate a coordinate of that feature that we're measuring. That's what happens when you're using an image. Every time you select a pixel in an image, if you're using an oblique image, certainly a pictometry oblique image, the software is automatically positioning that image on the sensor back up in the aircraft. You select a pixel, it's a pixel on the sensor, then it walks down that light ray back through the lens all the way down to the ground or the terrain model where it knows to stop. And using all that data, the starting point, what happens on the way down, and the terrain model for the where to stop portion of it, we can make some calculations, we can make accurate calculations as to the coordinate of that feature that we clicked on in that image. So there's three fundamental pieces. In a longer version, if we had an hour and a half or so, I would go into detail on all three of those questions. For now, I'll answer them briefly. You need to know where we're starting, right, if we're going to be able to make that measurement. How do we acquire that information? We use what's called a PAWS, a position and orientation system. This is essentially a GPS plus an inertial measurement unit. The GPS gives us location, the inertial unit gives us that orientation value, and also aids in the post-processing of that GPS data to give us highly accurate GPS data. That'll give us our starting coordinate for making those measurements. In order to know what happens to a light ray on the way down, we've got to be able to understand how it travels through the lens. The lens is a big physical, large physical object. It's got a, it's complicated. There's a lot of traveling in and out between different pieces of glass. So we've got to model that. We create the lens with the idea in mind that it's going to pass through in a perfect geometric calculable way. That, of course, doesn't happen because of the fact that it's that large physical object. So we model that, and we can use that process called camera calibration in order to make sure we can take into account what happens through that lens. Now, the third thing we need to know when we're doing our ray tracing option is where to stop on the way towards the ground. And we'll talk some more about that later and how we fold that particular data piece in. So collection requirements. For a traditional ortho imagery flight, when your camera is mounted in the nadir position, you fly over the target that you want to image, and you're going to get an image of that target. Now, the height over ground that you're flying does affect the ground sample distance and the total coverage. So if I was flying lower, I would have less coverage, but at a better GSD. If I'm flying higher, I'll have more coverage at a little bit lower GSD, depending on the difference in my flying height. Now, with oblique imagery, I've got to, again, make sure my camera's in the right spot, but it's not directly over the target this time. So now I'm looking off to the side. I'm aiming down at some feature that's not directly underneath the camera, and I'm saying, okay, that's the feature I want to capture. Now, in an oblique system, that height above ground has a, dictates very strongly what I'm going to capture, not just the GSD at which I'm going to capture it, but if I'm flying at a different height, I'm now actually looking at a different spot on the ground. So there's a very strong dependency when you're flight planning for oblique imagery collections on how high above the ground your aircraft is positioned. You also need to have a pretty good idea of where that ground is. If you don't have a terrain model to model the ground, and the ground said there's this mountain happens to be here, my coverage will now actually be affected by the presence of terrain features that I might not have been aware of. So I've got to have a good idea of what the shape of the ground is in order to ensure I'm going to get full coverage. So with regards to some of the different technologies that can be used for collection of oblique imagery, typically, you have two different types of sensors. You have frame cameras and you have push-broom sensors. Now, when it comes to frame cameras, you have large format mapping cameras. These are your traditional photogrammetric mapping cameras that are used to collect ortho imagery. Pictometry, like I mentioned before, it's a technology company. We've developed our own sensor system. This is the Pictometry Pentaview sensor system. It uses a small format camera, and you'll see why in a few minutes here. And again, then the other type of sensors, the push-broom sensors, which essentially give you a single line continuously, or a very small, long track collection as you move forward. So how do we define a small format versus a large format camera? Well, we typically define that based on the field of view that an individual frame is going to provide for you. Field of view is measured if I'm in the nadir position, I'm looking straight down towards the ground. You'll see in the center of this this disc on the ground, I've got this black dot here. That's directly underneath the camera. That point is called the nadir point. And as I move away from that a certain amount of degrees, that area that I'm now encompassing and looking at is what we call the field of view. So if I have a camera that follows these dotted lines here and essentially provides me with a view of all this in here, that camera has a full field of view of 20 degrees. If, on the other hand, my camera extends all the way out to here, that camera has a full field of view of 50 degrees. So I mentioned before that Pictometry's camera is called a small format camera. If we look at, and what do we mean by that, right? So if we take that previous disk there where we've got about 10 degrees out to the edge of this green, 15 to the edge of the yellow, 20 to the edge of the orange, and 25 out here to the edge of the red frame, the red disk. If I'm looking through the lens of a Pictometry camera, I'm going to see about this much of the ground. So I've got about a 10 degrees forward and back, so a full 20 degrees across that image there. And if I go side to side there, if I go up and down in this view, I've got about 30 degrees full field of view, in which case I'm coming about 15 degrees away from the nadir and about 10 degrees away from the nadir towards the side there. Now if we contrast that with a large format camera, you'll see that there's a significantly greater coverage area within a particular frame from a large format camera. So why do we use a small format camera for oblique imagery? Well, a small format camera captures what I call the ideal perspective for an oblique image. You're looking at about 50 degrees away from the nadir point, and then you've got the field of view is built off of that rather than built off of a straight down to the nadir point. It gives you about this perspective here. Now, if I were to use a large format camera and mount it in an oblique position with the same central axis, I would end up, and actually I think it's actually larger than this, but the field of view here is so large I can't really fit it on this slide to show this perspective properly. You get a lot of data, additional data down towards the nadir side where I've got nearly an ortho image, and I've got a lot of data up at the other end of the image where it's the far field high oblique part of the image, which is where you're looking through a lot more atmosphere, and you get a lot of lower quality image there as you would in any oblique. Near the top you get a lot less there. So in order to be efficient with the data collection, we've used a small format camera that captures that sweet spot of data in the center. Now another reason to use a small format camera for an oblique imaging project in particular, as well as for an ortho imaging project, is a phenomenon called exposure fall off. And what this has to do with is as I move away from the center of my optical axis there, that central ray that travels out at the direction my camera is facing, I'm going to change the path to the ground. So if I'm looking here in the nadir position and my camera's got about a 17-degree maximum field of view to either side, which is actually the corner of a Pictometry image, if I'm flying at about 2,500 feet above ground, the edge of my image is going to look through about 2,615 feet of atmosphere. The center is looking through about 2,500 feet. That means that we've got an increase of about 5% across the entire frame. So the maximum is about 2,600, the minimum is about 2,500, about a 5% change there. With a very large format camera, what happens is I've got about 2,500 feet down to the center, about 4,300 feet if I had a 55-degree field of view. This gives me an increase of about 74%, which means that I've got to, in order to create a single consistent image, I've got to take into account a lot of different conditions and different light and brightness levels across that frame. With a small format camera, everything's a lot more uniform. And unfortunately, if you want to make something uniform, you can't take the bad stuff and just automatically make it good. You kind of have to take the stuff that's good and reduce the quality a little bit in order to smooth that out and give it an even appearance. So again, this is why we don't want to have all of this data influencing the way an image would be processed. That data out here, the far field, high oblique end of it, as well as some of the cases, the data down here, where it's nearly an orthogonal perspective anyway. Now, with regards to the numbers on the previous slide, if we were to put mount a large format camera with a 55-degree field of view at the same angles we mount a Pictometry camera, this top line right here would be about 23 times the length of the line down here, just for to give you a little bit of a perspective there. Rather than 74%, it'd be about 2,300%. You probably wouldn't mount it exactly that way. You'd probably mount it somewhat differently. I'm not aware of anyone using this full-size camera to perform this collection, though, for those reasons. Now, a push-broom sensor gives you essentially a zero along-track field of view. So rather than this field of view as shown here, which would be a typical pictometry along-track field of view, the distance from here to here, again, that's about that 10 to 15 degrees in here. Actually, it'd be 10 degrees this way if we're looking at a long track directly, and then another 10 degrees here. The push broom is going to give us essentially just that central field, that central row of pixels, if you will, not providing any of the spread right there. Now, one of the reasons we chose not to use push broom sensors is that you get a change in perspective, a continuously changing perspective as I'm imaging a particular area. So for instance, right here, I've got my camera's mounted right here on an aircraft. I'm looking along this red line right here down at the base of this little square building, and I'm taking an image of that area, and that's all well and good. But by the time I'm going to be imaging the top of that building, my aircraft will have moved. And that means that the top of that building now is captured from a different perspective than the base of that building, which is going to give me a measure of a distortion that I can show a similar effect of it a little bit later on. I don't have any actual samples from the push brooms.
I can't open up my mailbox.
So again, with the
Can we please mute our phones? If you could, please.
So again, with the pictometry frame oblique system, you're going to capture that ideal oblique perspective across an area, which allows you to view the base of the structure, as you can see right here, from the same place as you view the top of the structure, which is the way you would view something with your eye as you're looking towards the ground. So let's talk a little bit about data presentation. Oblique imagery is different than ortho imagery. We've got to come up with the, in an oblique image, you've got varying scale across the frame. That's the #1 difference there. You've got every pixel has its own GSD, its own resolution, its own sample size on the ground, rather than in an orthorectified image where everything is the same. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment too. But that's the fundamental difference here, is that typically with an oblique image, you've got a different scale across the board. Now, in order to make those measurements, I talked about before with the 3 different elements of accuracy, or the 3 different pieces of the fundamental questions that you needed an answer to, you've got to incorporate that terrain data so when I'm making a ray tracing measurement, I know where to stop. And I've got 2 basic ways to do that. One is to warp the imagery to fit a rectangular data grid, which is what we call orthorectification. The other is to warp the data to allow the image to retain perspective. So I need that terrain model, because within an oblique image, I can get an extraordinarily large error based on a potential an error in the terrain model. If I think the terrain is up here where this dotted yellow line is, I'm going to select this point here, this red X, when I'm doing my ray tracing operation. That's where I'm going to stop, and I'm going to calculate a coordinate. If the ground is actually located down here at the green line, I'm going to basically introduce this size of an error, roughly equivalent to the error in the terrain model. With a good terrain model, I can reduce that horizontal error by having an accurate Z value in my terrain model. I'll know where to stop my ray tracing operation. So one of the ways that we can bring that terrain data in is the process called orthorectification. And orthorectification is a process whereby we convert images or complex maps into simple maps. And I call them simple maps because the idea with the orthorectification process is I can take an image that might otherwise require software like that's what we use in Pictometry, Pictometry Connect, or electronic field study, that's performing that ray tracing operation every time I want to select something in order to make a measurement. If it's a simple map, now I can just count pixels because everything gets the same scale. So in order to do that, I run this process called orthorectification. We back out the elevation and the perspective, again needing that high quality elevation model, and I write out a new image. Pixels get squared off and remapped to a north-up grid. If you take a look like this, where it's kind of like a drape, but not exactly the same thing. You've got one large image right here where we're going to basically use this data that's below it in order to determine what color pixel should be placed at every coordinate on the ground. Now, as an example, you can take a quick look right here and see what we've got here. On the left, you've got a nadir image. This is an image not ortho-rectified. It's directly off the camera. This is the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas. I ortho-rectify that image. I mentioned earlier, we rotate it to a north-up grid, and it's resampled and rewritten out. This is actually a new image that's written. It's not the same image as captured off of the aircraft. I've got areas, everything's been resampled in order to rotate it, because none of my pixels in my final image are going to align precisely with the pixels in my source image. Now, we could apply this process of orthorectification to oblique imagery. The far fields of a large format ortho typically has a very high oblique angle to it. If you've got a 55-degree camera, the far field of an ortho, of a large format ortho, might be pretty close to the bottom of an oblique image. Now, the problem here is you've got to recall two things. One is that the elevation and perspective are backed out when you orthorectify, and the remapping to that north-up grid. So what happens if I orthorectify an oblique image? Well, here's a view of an ortho of a traditional natural perspective north-facing oblique image. You can see here it looks, it's as if you're looking out of an aircraft. This is what you would be looking at. If I orthorectify this image, this is how it turns out here. It's essentially, there's some compression going on, and there's a little bit of there's some distortion and some flattening that's going on. The distortion is introduced by the use of the terrain model behind it. Now, if we wanted to take a look at it in a detailed view, you can see here, here's my ortho-rectified image zoomed into a portion at the top of the image, where I can see that everything's kind of pushed back and flattened. It's not too bad here, but I can definitely tell that it's different than the detailed view of a natural oblique image, where I didn't get any horizontal compression, and you can tell that the structures here have preserved their normal geometry. Part of the reason for this effect is that the buildings and such are not part of the terrain model. Since they can't be perfectly registered, you've got to leave them out. You're now mapping this building to the surface below it, and it's going to smear and warp a little bit depending on the shape of that. And that effect is present in all orthos, but it certainly is exaggerated as you get out near the end. Now, that's all well and good. What happens when I'm looking at a south-facing oblique? Here's that natural perspective of a south-looking oblique image. You can see here I'm just, I'm looking down to the south, and I've got this shadow coming in, moving towards the west, for instance, or moving towards the east rather, in this area right here. If I orthorectify this image, well, remember, process of orthorectification is going to cause me to turn this image to a north-up grid. So now I've got a different perspective issue that's going on here. When I zoom in and take a look here, on the left-hand side, you can see what it looks like in a natural perspective oblique. And when I orthorectify it and rotate it, I've now got this orthorectified oblique on the right-hand side, wherein you get a kind of an uneasy feeling as you're looking over that image. It's almost like you're looking upside down. And you can see down here that these, there's a huge amount of this, the oblique image that's right here, but I've got that strange feeling that trees are all pointing down. I'm kind of upside down on this whole thing, whereas over here, I'm looking with a natural perspective. It feels a lot better, and it preserves that view of what I'm really looking at. How do we make measurements in oblique imagery? Well, earlier I talked about the three different fundamental questions. The where are we starting? That's that exterior orientation. And then part two, what happens to that light ray on the way down as I'm doing my ray tracing operation? And again, three, where do I stop? Now, we talked about one way of putting that data into an image, which was orthorectifying an oblique image. That would take that terrain data and put it back in there. And if I were to go back and take a look here, on my right-hand side here, this has that elevation data put into it, and I could now go ahead and make measurements counting pixels. The image on the left retains its natural perspective and doesn't have any of that data in it at the moment or hasn't been warped to the data. So the other option is to store that elevation data in my image without warping my image. Now, back in about when I started pictometry in the year 2000, we used to use what was called a flat ground plane. We would assign a single value to every oblique image and use that ground plane as the basis for measurements. So you'd perform your ray tracing operation. You'd have to pick a value in the sweet spot of the image, and then you'd get some degree of error, and it would be variable error depending on where in the image you're going to be measuring. In 2002, I believe it was, we developed a new process, a patented process called the Tessellated ground plane. This is the process whereby we store elevation data in the image trailer, resolved to a particular level that allows us to store that data as an array, whether it's a 1 meter array or a 5 meter array or a 10 meter array. The only trade-off here is storage space. This allows us to make a much more accurate measurement in an oblique image while retaining the perspective of an oblique image and not putting that ortho perspective onto that image. Okay, that's what I've got for today. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to take them now, Jeff, if you'd like, or if you'd like to do something for questions after. I don't know how you want to handle that.
If there's any questions now on what Thom's covered, we could take some now.
Hi, Jeff. Can you hear me? This is Chad Collins.
Yes.
I've got a question on the acquisition of traditional orthophotography. At the same time, you're collecting oblique imagery. Do you do that also with more flight lines with a small format camera?
Yes, we do. We do collect a native view as well, and we can produce orthophotography. Our orthophotography has, it's a little different than traditional ortho. Thom, you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, all those the effects I was talking about with regards to small format camera for oblique imagery also apply benefits to ortho imagery. Now, what you've got is essentially with the use of the small format camera, when I'm making a mosaic, almost all of the image is at the sweet spot or the most nadir part of a large format camera. So when I make a mosaic using the pictometry imagery, just put a number on it, typically you won't be using anything more than 11 degrees off of a nadir perspective when you create a mosaic. If you're using a larger format camera, you'll typically get up to about 25 degrees off of nadir. Now, there's a couple of other benefits.
In layman's terms, that means less building lean.
Yes, and also less occlusion by structures as well. If you're out at about 25 degrees, you could be occluding 10 feet of a behind every 20-story building or every 20-foot high building. If you're at 11 degrees, you're going to obscure about 2 to 3 feet potentially. And I think I misspoke there with the 10 feet. I think it's closer to 6 or 7. So you're going to get a lot more visibility to the ground level features that are close to structures with a small format camera. Things won't be occluded as much.
The other benefits, we're flying a lot lower with the small format camera, so there's going to be less atmosphere. The imagery is going to appear to be a lot more clean, vivid, and clear. The one, I guess it's a disadvantage, but sort of we've kind of fixed that, is there's going to be a lot more cut lines because there's going to be a lot more seams to fix because of the amount of frames we take.
Yeah, there are more frames there, but that perspective advantage that you get is it leads to a couple other advantages as well, like Jeff was mentioning, with the flying height, but also that exposure fall off that I talked about gives you much more even appearance across the frame, and it means a lot less blue buildup that you'll get as you're looking through more atmosphere near the edge of the frame.
Does that answer your question, Chad?
Yeah. Yep. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, this is Chad again. I have a three-part question this time.
Sure thing.
The accuracy of the measurements through your viewer, are they dependent on, obviously probably dependent on what type of terrain model you're using, DEMS versus LiDAR?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that is correct.
The elevation measurements are correct.
Yes, and so are that what I showed there in the last slide, where we incorporate that terrain model to as accurate as level as possible. That terrain model will govern your ultimate accuracy of location and measurement accuracy. If the only available model is a very low quality model, and that's what's incorporated, you'll have less accuracy than if you have a reasonably good model, which is going to give you a lot better accuracy. If you have a very poor model, there are things we can do to create a new model for use there as well.
That leads right into the second part of my question, is if Pictometry acquires LiDAR at the same time they're flying the oblique and traditional ortho photos?
We don't acquire LiDAR at the same time. We have some LiDAR systems that we operate. If we operate, we actually do have one system that operates LiDAR at the same time as cameras. One of the advantages of LiDAR is you can fly it 24 hours a day. So if you put it on a plane with a camera and you're only going to fly it when you're going to take images, you're now looking at about 16% utilization, because you're going to fly 4 hours and only the 4 during the day if you can. You don't get that opportunity to fly the rest of the day. So that's one of the reasons we haven't, plus obviously there's a significant capital investment associated with the purchase of a large number of LiDAR units. We operate 74 total aircraft. Be a lot of overhead to put a LiDAR on all of those. Mm-hmm. But we do have the ability to capture LiDAR data to enhance the accuracy of any oblique product and or ortho product.
And the third part of my question is if Jeff or Thom, will you be showing any samples of your viewer here, or could you?
Yeah, we could. And I will have some screenshots, but it'd be just as easy for me to pop over and show the viewer live.
I think that'd be great. Thanks.
Any other questions? All right. Well, I think I'm going to move over.
I do have one question. This is Ernest Kachai from Grand Traverse County. In the absence of a LiDAR, how would you develop your DEM? Or DTM, I suppose.
Well, we have a couple of different options. So one of the options would be, to utilize the standard offering would be to utilize the best publicly available DEM or best available DEM that can be provided by a customer. Alternatively, we could use stereophotogrammetry to extract a surface from the nadir frames, and or even and that can be utilized.
Shows the X down here by the Wi-Fi.
Yeah, sometimes the wireless profile of it doesn't know.
Somebody's phone's not muted.
Yep.
Yeah. So, did that answer your question, Ernie?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and move into the applications and uses of the oblique imagery. And if there's any questions, we can, you can interrupt me if you'd like, or we can just try to take them at the end like we did with Thom there. Okay. So, everybody, all of you use imagery in your day-to-day workflow. The oblique imagery can be used the same way. Just, there's more information available, and it's a lot easier to understand for the everyday user. So, what ends up happening, all the GIS data that's being created can be put in more hands because of the uses. So, we sell to both the government and the private industry. And the government, the uses are seemingly limitless. We keep finding out more uses, but obviously our largest users are the assessors, planning, building, public safety, and then in our private industry, we do a lot of work with the infrastructure, electric and gas, real estate, architecture, roofing companies, insurance companies, different things like that. So, like I said, the obliques provide more information to a user than a traditional ortho. If you're looking at this building, you're looking at this, from an ortho, it looks like a parking lot essentially, and to a non-trained eye, that's maybe what they interpret it as. But from an oblique perspective, you can now see, what it is, that it is a parking lot, that it's raised up off the surface. And also, by the way, you can notice things like the light poles and then measure how tall they are, because you have the ability in an oblique image to measure height. In the government application specifically, probably our largest user in the government area is property appraisal and property assessment. It's not going to eliminate field visits, although some places are using desktop review, if you will, where they use imagery taken from vehicles and oblique imagery to sort of almost eliminate field visits. It's used to validate your existing data, find unrecorded changes, defend your values during appeals. A lot of our customers during the property appeal process will have the imagery set up and right there in there so they can use it. All of the imagery is time and date stamped so that you can, you know exactly when that imagery was captured. We have one of our clients did a return on investment study to justify the cost in Jefferson County, Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky. They increased their appraisal productivity 300% plus and decreased the cost per parcel. It's around 70% across the board, just using it, saving, not going in the field to look at everything and only going in the field to visit what they actually needed. And then it integrates seamlessly with BSNA, which is probably the big player up there in Michigan, and then we have integrations with a number of other camera vendors as well.
I'll be right back. How's that?
Okay, give me like 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yeah. Okay.
All right, so let's look at a quick example of an assessment example. This is 1414 Wakazoo Drive in Holland, Michigan. If an appraiser was out in the field driving by, this is what they would see. Thanks to our friends over at Google for the Street View image here. But you can't get a lot of information from that. But if you look at it, you look at it from an ortho, you're going to get that type of information. And if you look at the same structure from an oblique perspective, you're going to get a lot more information. So now you get, this tiny little house, and you get a lot more information about it that you couldn't get from the street. In the same way, in Michigan, I know there's a lot of lake communities. So now you're going to be able to have a perspective to look at it from the lake and see what kind of things what kind of information back there you can get from the image from the lake perspective. And then, a lot of our clients in Holland, they have multiple years of imagery, so you can view, multiple years side by side, so you can kind of see what has changed over time. Again, and then one of the largest users of oblique imagery also in the government realm is public safety and 911 dispatch. No one calls 911 and says, I'm calling from the house with the gray roof. And that's right now the perspective that a lot of dispatchers have. But they may call and say, I'm calling from the red house. If only it was easy and everybody had different colored roofs and you could send people that direction. But more than 70% of 911 calls these days are from cell phones. And I don't know about you, but when I'm somewhere with my cell phone, I don't know the address of where I'm at all the time. And not all the time does the call get located correctly. So the oblique imagery allows for a lot easier landmarking of the call. The call taker can help landmark the caller depending on what they describe. And then the dispatchers can pass along the descriptions to the responders, pass along important information responders may need, like fence heights, elevation changes, cliffs, streams, et cetera, things like that they can see in the imagery. And again, the imagery can be integrated into a lot of the existing 911 mapping and CAD programs. So we integrate with more than 30 of them. And police and SWAT teams use our imagery extensively around the country for planning when they're serving high-risk warrants. They can see line of sight where the suspects may be able to see out the windows, where the entrances and exits to the house are, what kind of limitations, if there's a giant doghouse or a cage full of pit bulls in the backyard, things like that, they're able to see in the imagery. And then a lot of time investigations and interrogations, the police have used our imagery to bring up this nice, easy to understand image to someone where, and it helps refresh people's memory and lay out the scene. So here's a couple screenshots of oblique imagery being used in the 911 world. This is an integration with Intrado. This is with Geocom, and I believe this one is New World. So they have integrations directly within their system. Also in the government, the fire departments, we have fire departments, the firemen go around and they do pre-planning for schools, other large buildings, public buildings, the imagery is used a lot with those pre-plans because now they can see where the water hookups on the outside are, where the hydrants are that are close to it. And when you're on route to the scene, using the imagery in the mobile environment, they can turn night into day, see what's going on at a location when they're on the way to a location. And then you can identify potential sources of water, measure accurately to the hose length you need to reach the source. So not always do we catch imagery like this, but we, occasionally we will have some interesting things like this in our imagery. But this is a barn fire. This is, I believe, in Iowa. And obviously they wouldn't have this photo on the way, but on the way they had the previous photo. They would be able to see that there were multiple tanks of probably fuel. That looks like a tank of fuel over there and a tank of fuel here, so they could see what kind of things they were going to run into when they get to the fire. And then measuring of hose lays. As Thom explained, the elevation is built into our imagery, so we actually have a tool that will allow you to measure along the ground plane rather than as the crow flies. And when you're laying a hose on the ground, that can be a big difference in the length needed. If you're going through valleys, down hills, up hills, things like that, so you can do measurements like that. Emergency management. We have the ability to have a quick response and a quick turnaround for natural disaster imagery. You can use this for remote damage assessments, and then use the imagery to leverage so that you can get FEMA funding after the fact. You can have imagery of the damage. And when I say remote damage assessment, Hurricane Ike down in Galveston, Texas, and all of the bridges to the barrier islands were pretty much washed out after that, and they had our oblique imagery up on kiosks at each bridge so that the folks whose houses were out there could come and look at our imagery and see if their house was still there. And as you'll see in a picture I show you, in many cases their house wasn't there. It's just a few samples of some of the disaster imagery. This is the pier in New Jersey. I believe this is Seaside, New Jersey, before Superstorm Sandy, and this is the imagery after Superstorm Sandy. This is Crystal Beach on Galveston Island, pre-Hurricane Ike. Take note of the two red circles there. That's the same location after Hurricane Ike. This is Joplin, Missouri. Everybody remembers the tornado that was there a couple of years ago. That's post-imagery of Joplin, Missouri. In most cases, because of the size of our fleet, we're able to get in quickly, capture the imagery quickly, and then any disaster imagery, for our customers, we will process quickly and get it out the door, and we can get it up on our cloud servers, usually within a few days. GIS departments, the GIS managers and coordinators they're probably not always the end user, but they're usually involved in administrating it and providing the GIS data to be used with the imagery. So because of the easy-to-use nature, the folks in the various government offices that aren't trained users of GIS and understanding of ortho photos can look at an oblique and understand where they're at. So it's going to end up getting your GIS data used in many more offices and getting a whole of value out of the GIS data you work so hard to create. You can also use the oblique imagery for feature extraction to create data sets of things you can't see in your orthophotography. Trees, we've had people do tree canopy studies. You can measure the heights of trees. You can locate poles, fences, parking meters, hydrants, entrances, access to buildings. A lot of things that you could create data from an oblique that you just can't get that data out of an ortho photo. And then you can use the tools you're used to. The obliques integrate seamlessly with the GIS applications you're currently using, like ArcMap, ArcGIS Server, AutoCAD Map, and some others. Just a few screenshots of obliques being used in ArcMap. The integration with ArcGIS Server. This is a Silverlight integration, a Flex integration. And then, so using in infrastructure and utilities, electric utilities have been using our imagery, or oblique imagery, a lot for new line design as well as monitoring the encroachments. So they have so much time to get things that are encroaching in their right-of-way out before they're responsible for it. Believe it or not, we did a corridor project for an electric company down in the south, and they were finding deer stands attached to their high voltage towers, attached to the actual tower. They were able to find those in the imagery and remedy that. The obliques can be captured typically less expensive than a rotary capture, taken from a helicopter, and then the same way with our government clients, we can do with our infrastructure clients, we can do a quick and response to disasters after storms. So we can fly the corridors. They can quickly assess what damage is there before they have to see if they need to call in crews from out of town. A lot of times when the hurricanes come, all of the power crews from Ohio and Michigan everywhere go down south to help fix up things. Same way with oil and gas. These pipelines that are running across the country, a lot of times you don't know they're even there because they're underground. But they have GIS data that shows them where they are, and they have to classify what's called high consequence areas. Essentially areas where there's going to be people or large groups of people, essentially knowing what's going to be damaged should that pipeline blow up. And they have to classify those and then throttle back the pressure within those pipelines accordingly, depending on what it is. And currently, they're using just standard off-the-shelf, freely available imagery from Google or wherever. But with the obliques, they can, more accurately classify things, tell if it's a school, tell if it's an inhabitable structure instead of a farm structure, and get a lot more information from the oblique imagery. One use case, Cheniere Energy used our oblique imagery to map their corridor, get a clear understanding of what structures were in their oil pipeline corridor. They integrated it directly into their integrity management system. They were able to, identify things that, were previously classified as uninhabited, as, and how they were definitely inhabited.
Almost done. Almost.
And then another example, TransCanada, they used oblique imagery to plan out a new pipeline construction, so they could see what kind of things were going to be in the area for vegetation analysis, high consequence area classification, and then changes in elevations along the area around. Another use that not a lot of people are familiar with is we're able to extract high-resolution, realistic 3D models directly from the oblique imagery. We do not need to take LiDAR to extract the structures. The details of the buildings are realistic because we have a 360-degree view, and the textures get extracted directly from the oblique. I knew this embedded model wouldn't work, so I linked out. So play this real quick.
That way it's still amazing. Yeah, no, I already brought that up for enough.
So these models were created directly from the oblique imagery. No need to fly and add additional costs to it. Because of the 360-degree nature of the obliques, all of what's on the sides of all the buildings is realistically what's there, and it's not an artist's rendering of what's there. So these are true to life 3D models, and we've done these a number of places around the country, as you can see, and they can be delivered in various formats. You can use them in Google Earth or Autodesk, or we have a number of different viewers where they can be used in. And they're used to determine line of sight, view shed analysis, wind modeling. In Indianapolis, they had a large windstorm come through and knock some windows out of a high-rise, so they used the models to model where the wind would be affected.
I would gather like a 1 gigabyte, so I have the like a type in it. So they have like a
Is there a question? All right, so I think that is all I have. Are there any questions about anything we've shown so far? And I know we had a request to show the viewer, so I could pop over and show that if there's, after we answer any questions. No questions? All right, let me pop in and I'll show you the viewer.
I have a question coming from Eastern Michigan University. Are you ready for it?
Hi, we are a private vendor. Are the images available in an archive
Can you repeat that question again? I'm sorry.
Are the images available in archive? I see that you had a scene that was a leaf-off January scene. Are the flights statewide, or is this per order?
We don't have imagery of the entire state of Michigan. I showed a slide earlier of our coverage in Michigan. I can show you. I'll bring that up again. But we don't normally fly on spec. We fly when the customer orders imagery from us.
Okay. And is that imagery only for their purchase, or is there archive that could also be purchased?
Yes, we have imagery. We have existing imagery that could be purchased. And if you're in Michigan State there, that's Ingham County, I believe. We have imagery of Ingham County that was captured in spring of 2007. It was a little leaf on, I believe. Most of our imagery that was captured for non-governmental clients was leaf on. But we do have imagery there in Ingham County. So that's our coverage in Michigan currently.
Thank you.
Another question from Eastern Michigan University.
Yes. Oh, you're in Washington, Eastern, I'm sorry.
Hi, my name is Kathy Stack. I'm with DTE Energy, and I work in the gas transmission department. I have a question about the high consequence areas. Could you speak a little bit further, any kind of examples on the how the orthos have helped in using in dealing with high consequence areas?
The oblique imagery?
Yes.
Yeah, there's a number of cases. Obviously, most vendors we've talked to, the infrastructure folks, they're using whatever's available to them. In some cases, they have good imagery. Some cases, it's just whatever's on Google or Bing, and they don't know how old it is. Our imagery is time-of-date stamps, and you can see the size of things. So in that one sample I showed, those buildings were previously classified as farm buildings. But in the oblique imagery, you could zoom in, you could see there was you could see they were inhabited. There was a trampoline outside. There was porch furniture. I mean, things like that. You're able to classify buildings, schools, pools. You're able to get a lot more information from the oblique imagery, and we can fly the corridors of just your corridor that you need. So you would have fresh imagery of what you're looking for, what's there, and then be able to measure how far away it is from where your pipeline is, and then classify what exactly it is. And it's something that we can either just provide the imagery, or we can actually help out with the actual classification. And we've done that with, like I said, TransCanada, Chenier Imagery. There was a couple others, but we'd be happy to go in a little more depth of that at some other juncture.
Okay, thank you very much.
If there's any other questions, please feel free to jump in. This is one of our viewers. This is part of our Pictometry Connect cloud-based viewer. So this is going to, this imagery comes over the web, serves up the oblique imagery. And it's sort of like a cache service where you're only going to bring in what you need, but it's a service that we developed. This is a lower resolution oblique, taken from a higher altitude, but when I zoom in, you're going to be able to see the higher resolution oblique imagery. And you can bring in your GIS data, so you can have your parcel lines overlaid, street center lines, and get a lot of different information. And then again, you can rotate around and see all four sides of the structure. So right now we're north facing. I can rotate around. Now we're looking to the west, to the south, to the east. And all of the imagery is intelligent, and you can use our measurement tools, so I can measure how tall fences are, how tall the light poles are. We have a few tools in here if I wanted to measure the pitch. So I can measure the roof, the area of that section of the roof, the eave height, the peak height, the roof angle, and the pitch of the roof. So you can get more information, things you can't do from you just go out in the field. And then as I mentioned before, there's the elevations built in. Let me find a good area here. So Thom mentioned, we build the DEMs into the imagery. This is a DEM. This DEM here is based on LiDAR, so it's going to be a little more accurate. But we can measure spot elevations above the ground. So spot elevation up there is 668. Down here, 281. If I drag my line, it's going to give me the difference in elevation from the beginning point to the end point. And then I mentioned we could take a distance measurement that takes into account the ground plane. So we call that walk the earth. So we can actually measure along the ground rather than as the crow flies. And that's something you can turn on or off. So if you need to do just an over the as the crow flies measurement, you can turn that on as well. And then elevations can be drawn on, or the contour lines can be drawn on the obliques as well based on the elevations that are within the imagery. Obviously, they're not going to be as smooth and pretty as an actual layer you may have, but it's going to give you a quick layout of what the elevation is going to look like.
Hey, Jeff, with that image you have there, can you do like a profile map with that, showing elevations along that line, or is that something that's not developed currently?
Not currently developed. That's a great idea. Thom can take that back and start working on it, right, Thom?
Question from Easton.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Lacey Dennis, and I was wondering, are you aware of any other biological applications? I know you mentioned tree canopy. I was wondering if anyone's ever had you get oblique imagery from areas that are inaccessible, or have been able to do any type of population studies, such as large mammals? So any other?
I don't know if there's large mammals enough. I've always liked to look at the zoo by my house, and you can see the elephants. But other than that, I know biological. I know we have a customer down in southern Ohio that actually our imagery was a little bit leafy one year for them, and they were able to pick out honeysuckle, which I guess is an invasive species. So they were able to use it for that. And I know it depends, obviously, for vegetation, it's going to be difficult because it's all going to depend on what time you fly. So you can find invasive species that way. The imagery as well for bodies of water, our imagery is going to be really a natural-looking color. There's no algorithms put through to bleach it out. So if you're looking at algae blooms in water and things like that, you're going to be able to see a lot more clearly the coloration changes in water with the oblique imagery as well, because we're lower. And then we've had one of my clients was the health department, and they liked the imagery because they were able to see, they were, without applying infrared, sort of able to find leaky septic systems and leach beds because of the coloration changes in the grass. But I don't know about tracking moose or something like that. That might be difficult just because of the tree cover. I know there's a zoo here that you could see the elephants in the zoo, but they look like they're all inside there.
So is the imagery, you said the oblique imagery right now is only available in natural color?
Correct. We do not fly infrared with the oblique imagery currently. It's something we are definitely looking into, but it's all natural color now.
Hi, this is Amy D.
Thank you.
Welcome. Yes.
How many oblique images are taken, and how do you pick which ones you use?
Thom, are you still on?
Yes.
You want to explain how many? Like, I guess we could start per square mile, Thom. How many 3-inch images are captured per square mile?
Let me just grab something so I don't give the wrong answer.
We leave, I'll just interview a little bit, how do we choose what to use? We leave everything that is deemed usable in, So there's a lot of overlap. There's going to be about 40% overlap. So what may be the edge of one image when I move over is going to be in the middle of another. So if we leave anything that's usable in, anything where you get a lot of glare or glint off a shiny building or a body of water, and it makes the entire image unusable, we'll take those things out. But if there's any part of the image that's usable, we leave it in there so that, because you're not going to want to take something out. We don't want any holes in our imagery, essentially. But Thom can speak tomorrow about how many images are captured.
Yep, here we go. I will. So okay, at 3-inch GSD, we would typically capture about 40 images per direction. So that's 160 oblique frames roughly per square mile. And then there's going to be, there's overhead on top of that sometimes, as well. So you're probably looking at closer to 200 frames per square mile on the oblique side. And there'd be about 80 to 100. It depends on where in the flight patterns they fall for nadir imagery.
Thank you.
And then that's one of the reasons why our cloud solution is become almost necessary. It's because with our 26 megapixel cameras and the amount of imagery that's delivered, the delivery sizes have gotten larger and larger and larger. So it's become easier for you to access the imagery by the cloud. Any more questions?
Jeff, this is Chad Collins. Can I have another question here, which is kind of geared toward the assessing group?
Yes.
You do have correct me if I'm wrong, but you do have a change detection option.
Yeah.
Where, if you had building footprints in place already, perhaps you can detect any kind of new construction that isn't permitted. Is that correct?
Correct. What we recently did a project in Washtenaw County. We used their existing building outlines, compared them to an older set of imagery to find what had changed over the years. Let me bring something up here.
Sometimes that can be a justifiable option to get this type of product just for the tax base.
Right. And what we do is, if you don't have existing outlines, we take 2 sets of imagery. We create outlines we create building outlines from the newest set of imagery, and then we compare them to an older set of imagery and flag what's changed. So it would be flagged as changed, new, destroyed, possibly changed. It's about 2% error, and that's usually caused by, trees, pine trees that are hanging over something where we just couldn't necessarily, tell exactly what was changed. And here's some examples. This is a change finder deliverable. This is so you can see that they're color coded according to change. I can bring up 2 sets side by side here. So on the right we have 2012 imagery, and on the left I can switch it back to, we'll say probably their 11 is one. Yeah. And you can see that there was a significant addition put on this house. I can turn the building outlines off here. So you can see the size of the house changed significantly. There was a large addition on the back between the 2 years, and that was found through the change detection. You can see actually in one of our images that it was actually under construction. So yeah, that's something we can do, and we can usually do the whole county in about 90 days in the deliverables, the geodatabase, and they're classified. We actually will break down the changes by township if you want. We can break them down, and the changes are broken down by percentage of change as well. So you can find the things that have the most amount of change. Those are the ones you want to look at first. And we can, if you're building outlines from scratch, part of the deliverable also is the dimensions of those outlines. Now they are roof outlines; they're not footprints. I think a lot of times the footprint is thrown around when it's not truly a footprint, and we're pretty open about the fact that ours are roof outlines. Any other questions about anything? Is there any way, I mean, if anybody want to see what using the oblique imagery within ArcMap?
That'd be great.
Okay. If you guys have like 20 minutes for ArcMap to boot up, almost there.
How you guys doing?
I know all you folks are from IMAGIN, but I will be if anybody's going to my camp, I'll be at my camp in a couple weeks. So, if there's any other questions or you want to play around with something live, you can come find me. So we have the ability to integrate directly within ArcMap here. And we have an extension, the Pictometry extension, that allows you to view the oblique imagery, and it brings it up in a separate window because, as Thom had mentioned, they're based on a different type of grid system. So I clicked on the ground where I wanted to see an oblique, and it brings up the oblique. It's a little slow the first time it loads up, but.
So Jeff, this extension is feeding off of either a local server or a cloud server?
Correct. Yeah, there's two different extensions. One hits off of our Pictometry Connect cloud servers, and one hits off of if you had our standard delivery, whether it be on a server, an external hard drive, or whatever. One of them, we have one version that hits off of that. So it could be used either way. So this is it shows the location of where the crosshair is. This particular version is hitting our cloud server, so I can pan around and kind of, it's seamless. All the measurement tools are in there as well. And then we have the ability, if you needed to, we can bring this oblique image and put it over in the standard image frame. So I have a button here called Add Image to Map. What it does is it extracts that image out. It's going to rectify it to the ground plane. So sort of like ortho-rectifying an oblique, it's going to look a little funky, and you'll see the difference. But if you needed to make a nice map with an oblique image as the background, you could do that. It's going to match everything to the ground, so all of the vector data will overlay. Normally it doesn't take this long. Technology.
I think we can all relate.
Yeah. I actually have a new computer on order. My computer has been giving me fits lately. There it goes. So I'll it brought this image in. It's a Pictometry image, but after ArcMap 10, Esri has recognized our image format as an image format. So our oblique images can be read natively in here. But as you can see, it just looks sort of warped, if you will. Everything on the ground is matched. The parcels, the center lines, everything like that matches correctly. But everything above the ground is going to look a little warped. And the taller the building, the more evident it is. Earlier, Thom just showed houses, but if you brought in a high-rise building that were in Ortho-Rectified, it would look even worse. But you can bring in multiple ones of these and essentially create a simple mosaic if you're creating this map and wanted to have an oblique perspective in there. So, and you can actually even, I don't know if I still have that button on here, but you can load in multiple oblique images, and we have a little widget that allows you to actually rotate the map frame.
Now, Jeff, this is Chad again. Does this integrate with 3D Analyst, do you know?
3D Analyst, I don't think natively, but the extension works on, 3D Analyst is an extension of ArcMap, correct? If I'm
correct.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what you were looking to do with it, but I don't know if our imagery is the 3D perspective of our imagery is understood by 3D Analyst at this point. And then we have integrations with the ArcGIS server as well, and then I showed the quick screenshots of the Silverlight and the Flex integration. And if there's other, there's counties out there. You could go to one of the counties that has an integration. If you want to go to is Cumberland County, Pennsylvania. You could all go to their website, and they have our Flex integration. Any other questions about anything? I'll put my contact info up there. If anybody thinks of anything after the fact, my contact info is right there. Thom Salter's email is there. If you wanted to call Thom or email Thom with any questions. I thank everybody for taking some time today. And if anybody thinks of any questions or wants more information, please feel free to contact me. Like I said, I'll be up at Boyan in a couple weeks, and hopefully get to meet some of you all up there.
Great presentation. Thanks, Jeff and Thom.
Thank you, guys.